Oh, hello everybody, my name's Hugh Davies. I'm with the University of British Columbia, and I'll be co-presenting this with the other team lead, Audrey Smargiassi from the University of Montreal. So I also want to thank Jeff and Eleanor for all their work on this and the rest of the team. I think noise is one of those things that's on a cusp, and I think this could be the sort of catalyst that really propels it forward in Canada. We might catch up a little bit on where the Europeans are on this as a research and policy topic. So that's our team right now. I want to point out again that Daniel Raynham is on a boat in the Caribbean, although he's supposed to be on sabbatical. It's not the kind of sabbatical that I had. We're also open to new members, and part of the exciting, one of the exciting parts of this has been identifying other individuals in Canada and noise sources of noise data. So we'll be having our meeting at 8 tomorrow and invite people to drop by and introduce yourselves and hopefully bring us data. So this talk will follow the same basic outline as the previous one. We've been given a number of topics to speak on. I'm going to start the session with an overview of noise research and where we are, particularly in Canada. This reflects, this first slide, more general situation of research on noise and health. The basically noise is a very potent stressor, and that's at sort of the heart of the most commonly recognized pathological mechanism, which I've shown on the right here. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but essentially the top half shows how noise acting through two different, quite different pathways, one involving more sort of active cognition and the other subcortical pathways that link sort of directly into the arousal centers of the brain and can operate, if you like, subconsciously, the kinds of things that makes your alarm clock work in the morning and wake you up out of a deep sleep. Both of these can essentially cause a stress reaction, both physiological and psychological stress reaction, which then sort of cascades down through the stress and health pathways that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, activation of the autonomic nervous system and metabolic changes, particularly the activation of stress hormones like the catecholamines and cortisol, leading to potentially a wide variety of endpoints. So the most well-established endpoints that have been studied for many, many years now would be annoyance, stress, sleep disturbance. I don't think anyone would have any major surprise at that. However, over the last 40 or 50 years, there's been interest in the role of noise in cardiovascular disease. And following that kind of research, you can sort of track the overall trajectory of noise research. It started sort of semi-experimentally, animals and humans, acute noise exposure, blood pressure changes, heart rate changes. The early data from the 50s, 60s, and 70s was of relatively low quality and led to a lot of sort of confusing results. And then as we got into the 80s and 90s, the quality of the studies improved, and we started to see more consistent results. However, there was this issue of co-exposures and what, in fact, in the urban environment was causing some of these cardiovascular disease outcomes we were looking at. Was it noise? Was it air pollution? What was it? And so the most recent phase, and the phase we're in now, is where we're looking at co-exposures, and what we see is indeed that there are independent effects of these exposures, and that noise often is as potent a disease causal agent as some of the others that we'll hear talked about today, such as air pollution. So cardiovascular disease includes hypertension. We see positive association with hypertension. We see it with ischemic heart disease and, to some extent, stroke. Other outcomes which follow from, which might be predicted from this model, include a number, as I say, of outcomes. The ones that have had some research, which has been suggestive of health effects, are cognitive effects in children. So there's quite a bit of data from particularly Europe which suggests that increased noise from community sources such as aircraft, road, and rail can cause issues around memory and learning in deficits in children. Adverse birth outcomes, so we have studies that show that noise exposure to pregnant mums leads to low birth weights at birth, and then following the sort of metabolic potential pathways, people are starting to look at things like diabetes, and we're starting to see positive effects from some of those studies as well. In terms of the overall research gaps, we're already starting to see some similarities to the previous speakers. So one area of great interest is following on from the birth effects and then the fact that we see learning deficits is the issue of early child development. And we've got a birth cohort, for instance, in BC, which those kids are already now in high school. So we've got a great potential there to look at the entire life course in terms of noise exposure and effects. Cancer, there's new studies coming online now that are looking at the potential impact of noise on cancer, either through stress or potentially through sleep disturbance. There's some hypotheses around changes in metabolic and hormonal perturbations with melatonin that might cause a link there, and intermediate physiological responses. So with a lot of cohort studies, it's hard to get that kind of balance of numbers in the study and also get that individual level data. We need more information on disease mechanisms, which is kind of linked to that last point. Effect of different noise sources on outcomes, roles of various noise characteristics. So noise is a very complex phenomena. As Jeff just pointed out, we've got some noise pollution going on right now, which is, and it's not just about the magnitude of the noise. That noise is, not harmful to you if you just measure its magnitude, but it's having all sorts of other effects on you. So there's things like pitch, predictability, control. There's so many factors which we now know have a modifying effect on the effect of noise on health. Combined effects, or looking at these co-exposures. So far we've been very good at looking at, I think, separating out and pointing out the independent role of noise and other exposures, but I think we want to go beyond that now and look at more how the combined effects may work in other ways, perhaps synergistically. Method development, as I say, exposure estimation, we'll get to that in just a minute, about how do we actually measure noise over large areas. It behaves differently from air pollution, clearly. It has different sources, it has different propagation pathways. You can't measure it by satellite, so we have to find other ways of developing exposure estimation methods. And we need to move beyond just measuring magnitude and then averaging them over long periods like we do now for typically a 1-year average. It makes it hard, for instance, to study things like exposure during trimesters during pregnancy. So a very quick review of where we're at in terms of data, and then I'll hand it over to Audrey. So the noise exposure data that's available in Canada now, and I said there may be more to add to this, and hopefully we'll find some of this in this 2 days now here. I'll let you have a look at that. Basically, we've got the region covered, the kind of metric and overall coverage if it was available, how it was prepared and how it's been linked. But you can see it is relatively thin when you compare to air pollution and even to green space, where national models are available or feasible through satellite imagery or other modeling techniques. Essentially, regionally, we're covering Vancouver, Halifax, Toronto, and Montreal. The general methods are either, but they're all modeling based, either land use regression or for noise, propagation modeling, deterministic modeling, has been used. It was what we used in Vancouver. Europe is way ahead of us in terms of noise exposure policy and techniques, and so there are a number of off-the-shelf products and you can avail yourself of to do noise modeling. But we know that using deterministic modeling is going to be a slower and probably more expensive way than going with land use regression modeling. So, and there's also a trade-off there, however, when you get down to small-scale detail, which can be important in noise exposure, as to whether we can get that sufficiently with land use regression. I'll also point out that although we say measurement here as a technique, there is no widespread routine noise monitoring as there is for air pollution, or it's rare if it happens at all. So we can't just reach out to the city and get years of data on noise, historical noise measurements, for instance. So with that, I'll pass it over to Audrey to continue.
So as with others, we had to identify our first quick wins, the actions that we're going to that we are going to initiate, and what we're going to do in the coming years. We actually had quick discussions with our current group, but of course, we hope that throughout this meeting we're going to refine our plan. So the first thing that we want to do is load the data that Hugh just showed you. And we want to actually document the information that's available for the various cities. We want to harmonize the data because eventually we want to compare and pool this information and maybe even develop from this data, for example, some land use regression model based on the measurements that are available for Canadian cities. Yes, one of our quick win is also to get involved in grant writing. There's a Health Effect Institute call for a study on noise and air pollution from road traffic, and we have to, I think, strategize and discuss together this call. I believe the CANUE is a great opportunity. Now for the coming years, we've got a number of ideas that we've discussed with the group. First of all, we want to document determinants of noise. For example, what are the road traffic data available for all Canadian cities, and this can come from the transportation group maybe as well. How about air and train movements? How about aircraft noise contour? What's available for past years? What's available regarding noise emission factors? So we can use this information to back extrapolate maybe noise levels that we currently have. We want to investigate temporal stability of noise exposure. So how was noise in past years? This is something that is difficult to do, and we do have to invest if we want to link noise data to cohort information. Yeah, as you mentioned, there are various approaches to estimate exposure to noise. Most people in Europe have used propagation models. We've developed land use regression models. We would like to compare those models, and some work is currently happening to enable this comparison. And there's also quick wins that can happen through reanalysis of some cohort data or some easy studies. Some studies can easily be done through linkage of our noise information with some cohort or birth outcomes databases. And in the longer term, as you mentioned, there's data gaps regarding mechanisms and which are the best noise metric, which are noise that best explain reactions, health reactions. So we want to explore new noise metrics. For example, is it the number of peaks that best predict my health outcomes, my stress or my cardiovascular health? Or is it the night noise level that's related to my health outcomes? We, of course, want to focus on providing estimates that will be linkable to cohorts data that were of importance for the CANUE. So the CLSA, the child, the CPTP cohorts are databases for which we'll first think of providing data for. Well, as I mentioned, we would like to try to estimate past noise exposure, maybe through the development of land use regression models, maybe through the development of propagation models. Maybe we will use some current measurements or even past measurements that we'll be able to find to develop past noise measurement estimates. And there's also some noise measurement nodes that will occur, or that is occurring right now. I know, Michael, you're doing that, and some people are doing that too, some measurements too, planning measurements here as well. So there's much data that we have to gather and see how we can use this information to provide estimates for health studies. Well, we don't have a listing of all noise grants that have been submitted or that are under preparation, and it would be interesting to know what people have in mind. Of course, the gap that we need to fill right now is to create noise maps for past years in order to link this information to cohort studies. This is an overview, a quick overview of the data that we may need that will also be gathered by other groups, such as the transportation group. So we'll need typical land use regression predictors if we want to develop land use regression models, including green cover, such as NDVI. We'll need traffic-related data, such as fleet composition, emission factors. We'll need infrastructure data, such as building footprints, height. We'll need the road, railway networks, and as I mentioned earlier, airport noise annoyance contours as well. If we want to develop models that will, propagation models, for example, that would integrate all noise sources. So there's, there are a couple of grants that were submitted that we know of, and I mentioned the HEI opportunities, so that's the actions that we've planned so far for the group.
About the distinction between acute and chronic exposure. I can see that for noise, there's probably more rationale for having both. But the question I had was, how can you actually capture extreme events in terms of noise exposure in land use regression models? Is there any statistical representation? Is there a path for that? What do you think?
I mean, we could develop land use regression models with temporal information and, I mean, develop daily or sub-daily models if we would like. I think that there is, in the environmental health field and even in the occupational health field, there's been very few studies on acute effects of noise, and I may be wrong, but I believe so. Although it may be interesting to do some panel study and look at how daily variation of noise affects daily cardiovascular function. I don't think that this is necessarily our priority for our group, because I think that we want to produce data that would be linkable to cohort data, but I don't know you if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I think the evidence so far would point to much more importance to the chronic effects, it is very hard to get at the acute effects. I think the direction, as Audrey says, we want to go in, if anything, is looking at the complexity of the measurement of the noise signal. So a time-weighted average may be entirely wrong for some things, like awakenings, for instance. If sleep is one of the main drivers of many of these outcomes, as we think it might be, there's good evidence, for instance, that people who don't even recognize that they don't awaken to noise, they get habituated, at least psychologically, to noise at night, aren't physiologically habituated, but it could be a matter of a few specific noise peaks during the night that do all the damage. So getting a handle on that nuance of noise exposure, I think, is really important, and something that we might be able to do in this research program.
Yeah, actually, your point is good, and maybe I didn't address directly your question. We could develop a land use regression model to predict the number of peaks, of high noise peaks, for example.
Thanks. There's a little detail that I thought maybe too detailed, but then I thought it's actually a good talking point for how CANUE can work. I noticed that the HEI call that you're talking about, they really want socioeconomic status to be a central part of it. So at first I thought, oh, no one wants to hear about this, but then I thought, well, it's interesting in the context of CANUE, because that's obviously an exposure, if you will, and it's kind of tied to what I think Mike Jarrett was saying, or maybe it was Rick Burnett. Everyone knows that socioeconomics is a huge driver, and Bert Bruncrief, anyway. So I guess the question is, we've talked about it. We haven't really talked about it except for in the philosophical sense. But what potential do we have in CANUE to make that a really harmonized data point that can be leveraged? So for example, you guys, are you going to be able to fly with that in time for this grant in a few months? Do you have it already? Do you need help? I mean, you could ask people, but I think socioeconomics is something we have to maybe even talk more about.
I totally agree. I don't know that I can answer the question specifically. Maybe someone else can. I mean, I know that CanCheck, for instance, would give us that kind of possibility. So certainly that's one of the main reasons we're obviously keen to pursue that with Paul, the place study, which would address that. Noise is interesting. I don't know that there is some evidence or some research there on associations or correlations with socioeconomic status. I don't think it's quite as straightforward as people might think, because there are different drivers. I mean, a lot of people are moving back into inner cities now because they want to get away from, they want walkability, and yet inner cities can be noisier places. So, and they tend to be the sort of more mobile and maybe affluent. And so it's not straightforward. It is something that we certainly want to look at. Yeah.
Hi, I just had a question around policy. I'm a policy person, so I'm thinking about what would be the public response to noise or any other problems that you might find. And so I was wondering if you have any intention of going in the direction of looking at policy interventions around noise.
I mean, basically anything is better than what we have right now. So just having people talk about noise, just having people invited to stand up here and talk about noise, and a policy person asking about it is like terrific. Noise policy right now, as you probably know, is fragmented. It's mostly at the municipal level. There's a few different policies regarding sort of new vehicles, but it's compared to somewhere like Europe and what they're doing there. I don't know if it's particularly been or evaluated yet, but we're way behind. And one of the other interesting, more specific things that can come out of this is because we know that what we've learned in the last 10 years is that noise and air pollution, although they are very correlated in some ways, they do have different sources, different propagation pathways. And so we have to be careful when we respond to one pollutant, for instance, air pollution. By reducing air pollution, you don't actually worsen noise pollution. because some of the interventions can certainly do that. So, or one.
By way of response to the socioeconomic question, so Neighborhoods and Health Group is coming up after the break, and we're certainly talking about that very explicitly.
Yeah, thank you. Briefly addressed the covariation between noise and air pollution, but I sort of didn't see it in the research agenda that you outlined. So wouldn't it be a quick win to, given all the excellent exposure surfaces that you have in Canada for air pollution, would it be a quick win to start with making a very detailed inventory of the covariation between air pollution and noise in the areas where you have noise?
Yeah. We'll add it to the list.
Yes.
I said we'll add it to our list. Thank you.